Like a silver streak across a midnight sky, our stories move with a speed and a brilliance that you will never forget. Experience high-octane drama and the thrill of a narrative that never slows down for anyone. Click subscribe now and catch the streak before it's gone.
The morning my wife of 41 years was buried, my son told me he loved me and that everything was going to be all right. I believed him. That was my first mistake. Her name was Eleanor. She was 61 years old, and she died of a stroke on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after her doctor told her she was the picture of health, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to prepare. One day, she was making coffee in our kitchen in her blue robe, humming something I couldn't quite name, and the next she was gone. Just like that. 41 years. And then nothing but the sound of a house that had forgotten how to be quiet. I am 64 years old. I worked as an electrician for 37 years, retired at 62, and spent the 2 years after retirement doing exactly what Eleanor and I planned, traveling when we could, tending the garden she loved, watching the grandchildren when our son needed us. It was a good life. Simple and good. I never needed it to be anything more than that. What I did not expect, what I never could have imagined, was the life insurance. Eleanor had taken out a policy years before I knew anything about it. She never mentioned it, not once, in all our years together. I found out about it from the attorney who called me 6 weeks after the funeral. $1.4 million. Eleanor, who clipped coupons and turned off lights in empty rooms and bought her shoes on clearance, had quietly been paying premiums on a policy for over a decade because she wanted to make sure I would be taken care of. That was Eleanor, thinking about everyone else even when no one was watching. I sat in that attorney's office and I cried like a child. Not because of the money, because she had thought of me. Because somewhere in all those ordinary Tuesday mornings, she had been carrying this quiet, careful love, and I never even knew. My son called me that evening. His name is Derek, and he is 38 years old. I told him about the policy. There was a pause on the line, just a breath, the kind you don't mean to take. And then he said, "Dad, that's incredible. We need to celebrate." He said he and his wife, Renee, wanted to come stay with me for a while. Help me around the house. Keep me company. I was grieving and I was alone, and it sounded like exactly the right thing. I said yes. They arrived that Saturday with 3 suitcases and a casserole dish. Renee hugged me for a long time at the door. She smelled like the perfume that always made me think of someone trying too hard. But I pushed that thought aside. She had always been a little difficult to warm up to, Renee, a little stiff and deliberate in the way she spoke to me. But she was Derek's wife, and she was here, and I was grateful. They settled into the guest room and we ate dinner at the kitchen table, the 3 of us. And for 1 hour it almost felt like something other than grief. What I did not notice right away, what I would only understand much later, was how quickly the conversation kept sliding toward money. Not obviously, not the way you'd notice in a movie, just small turns. What had the attorney said exactly? Had I thought about what I would do with it? Had I considered that the house might be too much to manage on my own? Each question wrapped in concern, in warmth, in the language of people who love you. I answered them honestly because I had nothing to hide. I was still waiting on the funds to be fully processed. The attorney had told me it would be 4 to 6 weeks before everything was settled and transferred. In the meantime, I was supposed to meet with a financial advisor, a woman named Patricia that Eleanor's attorney had recommended, to talk through my options. I mentioned this to Derek and Renee. Derek nodded and said that sounded smart. Renee said she had a cousin who worked in finance and might be able to offer some advice as well. I said I'd keep that in mind. That night I woke up at 2 in the morning because I heard voices. Low, careful voices coming from the kitchen. I lay in the dark and listened. I could not make out words, just the shape of a conversation happening in a place where conversations should not be happening at 2 in the morning. I told myself it was nothing. Derek had always been a night person. I went back to sleep. Over the next 2 weeks, small things accumulated the way small things do not. In a way that sounds alarming when you say them out loud, but in a way that sat in the back of my mind like a pebble in a shoe. Renee began making comments about my memory. Nothing dramatic, just small, gentle corrections. "Dad, remember, you already told us that story." Or, "You mentioned that yesterday. Are you feeling okay?" Once, when I couldn't find my reading glasses, which I later found in my own jacket pocket, she exchanged a look with Derek that she thought I didn't see. There was also the question of my medication. I take blood pressure medication every morning, and I had been taking it without incident for 6 years. Renee volunteered to manage it for me, said it would be easier, said she wanted to make sure I wasn't accidentally doubling up. I thanked her but told her I was fine. She smiled and said, of course, whatever I preferred. 2 days later, I mentioned to my neighbor Robert that I had been feeling dizzy in the mornings. Lightheaded. A little foggy. Robert is 71 years old, a retired pharmacist, and he has lived next door to me for 22 years. He asked me what medication I was taking. I told him. He raised an eyebrow and asked if the dosage had changed recently. I said not that I knew of. He said it might be worth double-checking, because that particular medication at a higher dose could cause exactly those symptoms: dizziness, confusion, difficulty concentrating. I went home and looked at my pill bottles. They looked exactly the same as always. But I thought about what Robert said, and I thought about the dizzy mornings, and I thought about Renee's offer to manage my medication, and something cold moved through me. I want to be clear about what I was feeling in that moment. It was not anger. It was not certainty. It was something quieter and sadder than both of those things. It was the specific grief of looking at something you love and beginning to wonder whether it is what you thought it was. I did not say anything to Derek or Renee. Instead, that afternoon, I drove to Robert's house and I asked him if he could tell, just by looking, whether a pill was the right dosage. He examined one of my pills and compared it to the reference in an old pharmacology guide he kept on his shelf. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me and said, the pill I'd given him was double the standard dosage for my prescription. I sat in Robert's kitchen for a long time. He poured coffee and set it in front of me and didn't say anything, because Robert understood that some information needs space before it needs words. When I could finally speak, I said, what would happen to someone my age, with my blood pressure history, if they were taking double the dose for several weeks? He said it would depend on the person, but he said possible effects included fatigue, cognitive slowing, difficulty with memory and concentration. And then he said quietly that in an older person with no prior history of cognitive issues, those symptoms, if observed and documented by family members, could potentially be used to raise questions about mental competency. The pebble in my shoe became something much heavier. I drove home slowly. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. Derek was in the living room watching television, and he smiled when I came in and asked where I had been. I said I went for a drive. He said dinner would be ready soon, that Renee was cooking. I said that sounded fine. That evening I did not take the pill Renee had set out on the bathroom counter. I set it aside. I also called Patricia, the financial advisor, from my car the next morning and asked her a question. I had never imagined asking another person, what would happen to a life insurance settlement if the named beneficiary was declared mentally incompetent? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the funds would likely be placed in a court-supervised trust, managed by whoever was appointed as guardian. I asked her who would typically be appointed guardian. She said usually a close family member. I thanked her. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store I had not actually intended to visit, watching people walk in and out with their shopping carts, and I thought about Eleanor. I thought about her sitting at the kitchen table late at night, writing out a check for a life insurance premium she had never told me about, tucking it away somewhere safe because she trusted that I would be all right as long as someone was watching out for me. I thought about what she would say if she knew what was happening in the house she had lived in for 30 years. I decided I was going to find out exactly what was going on before I did anything else. Robert helped me. He has a son who works in law enforcement, and through him we found out that there was a quiet way to proceed. Document everything first. Act Second. The next day, when I told Derek I was feeling a bit tired and thought I might lie down, I left my phone on the kitchen counter, positioned near the fruit bowl the way I sometimes left it when I was in a hurry. Robert had shown me how to use the voice memo application, how to start a recording with 2 taps and leave it running. I went upstairs. I listened to the ceiling. 20 minutes later, I came back down and picked up my phone. That evening, I drove to Robert's house and we listened together. At first, it was just the sound of the kitchen, dishes being moved, the refrigerator opening, then Renee's voice, clear and close. The appointment with Dr. Harmon is next Thursday. And Derek's voice lower, saying, "You think he'll cooperate?" And Renee saying, "He doesn't have to cooperate, Derek. He just has to show up." The documentation we have from the last 3 weeks is enough to start the conversation. And once Harmon sees the behavioral patterns. And Derek said, "What behavioral patterns, Renee?" "He's fine." And then a pause. And Renee's voice again, harder now, the warmth gone completely out of it. "He's not going to be fine much longer. That's the point." Derek did not respond. I sat in Robert's kitchen for the second time in less than a week. This time he didn't pour coffee. He put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. "I want to tell you about the moment I understood why my son hadn't said anything back to his wife. Because I've turned it over in my mind many times since then. And I think I know the truth of it now. Derek was not a cruel man. He was not the architect of what was happening in my house. But he was a man who had made choices he didn't know how to undo bad investments. I would find out later, and a second mortgage on their house that Renee's brother had convinced him to take out as collateral on a business that failed inside of 8 months. He was drowning, and instead of coming to me, instead of sitting across the kitchen table from his father and saying, "I need help," he had let his wife convince him that there was an easier way, a quieter way, a way that didn't require him to feel ashamed. That is the thing I keep coming back to. If he had just asked me, if he had just called me on a Sunday afternoon and said, "Dad, I'm in trouble," I would have handed him whatever he needed without a second thought. Not because money doesn't matter, but because he matters more. Because that is what parents do. Because that is what Eleanor and I spent 41 years trying to show him. But he didn't ask, and so here we were. I called Patricia again the next morning and told her I needed to move quickly on a few things. Then I called the attorney who had handled Eleanor's estate. He referred me to a colleague who specialized in elder law. I met with her that Thursday, the same day, as it happened, that Derek and Renee believed I had an appointment with the doctor they had arranged. I did not go to that appointment. Instead, I spent 90 minutes with an attorney named Sandra, and I laid everything out in front of her. The medication, the recordings, the pattern of behavior over the past 3 weeks, the financial situation I had quietly confirmed through a few phone calls, the failed business, the second mortgage, the amount they owed. Sandra listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You've been very thorough." I said I had a good teacher, and I meant Robert, but I also meant Eleanor. Sandra explained my options. We could involve law enforcement immediately, given that intentional medication tampering carried serious legal consequences. Or we could take a more measured approach, give Derek the opportunity to understand the full weight of what had been set in motion before it became a criminal matter. I asked her what she would do if it were her father. She said she'd give him one chance. I went home that afternoon, and I asked Derek to sit with me in the living room. Renee started to follow us in, and I said, gently but clearly, "Just Derek." She stopped in the doorway. Something moved across her face, a quick calculation, and then she turned and went upstairs. Derek sat across from me in the armchair that had been his mother's favorite. He looked tired. I realized with a pain I was not ready for, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I told him what I knew. All of it. I told him about the medication, about Robert, about what a higher dose could do. I told him about the recording. I watched his face as I spoke, and I watched him go through several different expressions before he settled on the one that was truest. Not anger, not calculation, but something broken and ashamed. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Dad." I stopped. Then he said, "I didn't know it had gone that far. I didn't know about the medication." He said it like a man who had told himself a version of events that allowed him to sleep at night and was now being forced to look at the real version. I thought we were going to help manage things. I thought that was all it was. I said, "Derek, your wife told you it would only get worse for me. You heard her say that, and you didn't say a word." He put his face in his hands. I told him that Renee would be hearing from my attorney, that there were legal consequences to what had been done, and that those consequences were no longer entirely in my hands to prevent. I told him I had moved quickly in the last few days to make certain that my financial affairs were properly structured and protected, and that there was nothing left in that regard that could be undone by any process his wife had set in motion. I told him I was not going to pretend none of this had happened, and I was not going to act as though the man sitting across from me had played no part in it. And then I told him that he was still my son. I told him that I had thought about Eleanor every single day of the last 3 weeks, and that the thing she would have wanted not just for me, but for him, was not destruction. She would have wanted him to reckon with what he'd done and come out the other side of it changed. She would have wanted him to be the kind of man she knew he could be, the kind of man she had raised him to be, before life got hard and expensive, and he stopped asking for help. I told him he could not stay in my house. I told him I needed time, and he needed to figure out what kind of man he was going to be going forward. I told him that when he was ready, really ready, not with apologies that were just another way of managing me, I would be here. He left that evening. I heard him and Renee arguing upstairs before they packed. I heard her voice sharp and insistent, and his voice low and flat, and then the sound of suitcases being dragged down the hallway. When he came to the door, he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said I knew. He walked out to his car. Renee did not look at me. Sandra handled the formal side of things over the following weeks. The medication tampering, once fully documented and presented, led to a police report and eventually to charges against Renee. Her brother, it turned out, had been the one who sourced the altered medication. He had a connection through a former co-worker, and he was charged as well. Derek cooperated fully with the investigation. His attorney later told Sandra that he had insisted on it, that he had refused any arrangement that required minimizing what had happened. That mattered to me. I want to be honest about that. It mattered more than I expected it to. The debt was real, and it was serious. With Sandra's help, I arranged for a portion of Eleanor's settlement to be used as a structured loan, not a gift, not a bailout, but a formal agreement with terms and a repayment schedule, the kind that required Derek to show up every month and face what he owed, not just financially, but in a larger sense. It was Sandra's idea, actually. She said, "Sometimes the most useful thing a parent can do is give a child a structure that asks something of them." I think Eleanor would have agreed. I still live in the same house. The garden is coming back. I have been tending it every weekend since March, and this year, for the first time since Eleanor died, I planted her tomatoes in the bed along the south fence where she always grew them. It is quieter here than it used to be, but it is a different kind of quiet now. Not the kind that sits on your chest, more like the kind at the end of a long day when you've done the work and you can finally sit down. Derek calls me on Sundays. We don't talk about everything yet. Some of it is still too new, still too tender around the edges. But we talk. He tells me about his week and I tell him about mine, and sometimes, at the end of the call, he asks if the tomatoes are coming in yet. I tell him they're not ready quite yet. He says he'd like to come see them when they are. I told him I'd be here. Robert came over for dinner last week and we sat on the back porch until dark. He asked me if I was angry. I thought about it for longer than I expected to. I told him I had been angry, deeply angry, in that first week when I sat in his kitchen and understood what was being done to me. But anger, I have found, is a fuel that burns fast and leaves you empty if that is all you run on. What I have now is something more durable, a kind of clarity. An understanding that money is a test that most people don't know they're taking until they've already failed it, and that the only way to love someone properly is to make sure they know they can come to you when they're failing before they start looking for other exits. Eleanor knew that. She always knew. The settlement is in a trust now, properly structured and protected, and one day, part of it will go to Derek's children, my grandchildren, to pay for educations and first homes and whatever good things the future holds for them. That is what Eleanor would have wanted. Not vengeance. Not punishment. Not a clean and satisfying ending where everyone gets exactly what they deserve. Just the slow, unglamorous work of keeping a family intact even after it is broken, one Sunday phone call at a time, until the tomatoes finally come in, and your son drives over to sit with you on the porch and eat something his mother taught you to grow. That is what I have. I think that is enough.